مترجم.
Partial funding for this program is provided by the Stratford Foundation.
The deal was struck 60 years ago.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You give us oil and we will give you protection.
Every president since has reaffirmed the arrangement. Over the years, both sides have benefited. Billions of petrodollars were recycled to buy expensive American military hardware. When necessary, America has intervened directly to keep the kingdom safe.
They found the oil for us, and they've been our friends ever since.
But there's always been another Saudi Arabia, one of fervent Muslim warriors, tribesmen with an innate distrust of outsiders. For them, the monarchy is corrupt, and the deal with America a bargain with the devil. Saudi preachers ascend their pulpits to rail against infidels and Jews. Saudi citizens have supplied millions of dollars to school and train jihadis around the world.
When it became clear that 15 of the 19 were Saudis, that was a disaster.
Now, Saudi militants have turned their sights on targets inside the kingdom and on Americans in Iraq. President Bush maintains that the Saudis are America's friends. Tonight, a special frontline history, House of Saud, the story of a troubled alliance. At the Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh, Saudi officials gather for a royal majlis. It's largely ceremonial, but speaks volumes about how this country is governed. It is presided over by the kingdom's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, a son of the kingdom's founder. To one side of the Crown Prince sit leading Wahhabi clerics, guardians of tradition who habitually resist change. On the Crown Prince's other side are the royal family and its retainers. Presumably, the two groups are partners in power. As male subjects come forward asking for favors, a new well for a village, or money for a daughter's wedding, they are participating in the modern incarnation of an ancient tribal custom. They are also here to enhance the royal family's image, to present the ruler to outsiders like us as benevolent and wise. This is government by patronage. There is no Bill of Rights here. Whatever the prince says or does, the tribal chiefs express gratitude and pledge loyalty.
باسمي والنيابة عن قبيلتي لسموكم بجزيل الشكر لإتاحة الفرصة لنا اليوم للتأكيد لسموكم ولحكومتنا الرشيدة أننا خط واحدا في وجه أهل الباطل والتشكيك والأهواء.
Afterwards, they all gather to pray. The Al Saud family conquered the kingdom in the name of God and the Quran.
Do you expect this to ever become a representative democracy?
I believe that Saudi Arabia, in a sense, is a democracy as it is.
Resistance to change is a matter of survival here. This is a nation in shock, where tradition and modernity are in violent collision. Few places on earth have come so far, so fast, as Saudi Arabia in the 20th century. Years ago, the Arabian Peninsula was a place of warring tribes. Nomads, sheikhs, emirs. Among them was the family of Al Saud.
At that time, the Saudi Arabian kingdom consisted of tribes and small fiefdoms. There was no unity amongst these warring groups. The Saudi Arabian kingdom was never united the way it is today, until the reign of King Abdul Aziz.
In 1902, with just 60 men at his side, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud rode out to begin his quest for a kingdom.
He certainly had a vision. He had a large, big vision of what he wanted this country to be. He wanted it to be a nation and to take its place among the nations, rather than to be a forgotten backwater where nobody cares what they live or die, what's happening there, but to be a player in the international scene.
But to conquer the whole Arabian Peninsula, he needed the fighting skills of the nomadic Bedouins known as the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan, or Muslim Brothers, were renowned warriors, light and mobile and extremely courageous. They were also fervent Wahhabi Islamic Puritans. To recruit them, Abdul Aziz had to commit the family to spreading their fundamentalist version of Islam.
The Ikhwan were an important fighting force that supported the expansion of Ibn Saud. They had this vision that they propagated true Islam in its purest form. So anything they encountered that differed from that vision was regarded as objectionable.
The nature of where they were coming from, the desert, was isolated really for almost 800 years. In the desert you have either day or night, you have cold or hot. You don't have these shades. Even the music is only one string. And that has kind of polarized the way of thinking. It's either black or white. It's either you're with me or against me.
The first Western reference we have to the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, comes from Captain Shakespeare, who was one of the early British explorers in Arabia. And he'd already heard that these people were fiercely anti-Western. Right from the beginning, this cutting edge of Saudi power was mistrustful of the West, and lethally mistrustful. For them to kill a foreigner might well guarantee their place in heaven.
With the Ikhwan troops, Abdul Aziz captured province after province of the vast desert. By 1926, he and the Ikhwan had captured the jewels of Arabia, Mecca and Medina, making Abdul Aziz the ruler of Islam's holy shrines. It brought prestige and substantial income from visiting pilgrims. It was also a great victory for the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis took their name from an 18th century Islamic preacher, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Wahhab was first to see the value in forging an alliance with the able tribesmen of the Al Saud family in order to help spread his austere version of Islam. The Ikhwan were living out Wahhab's dream, and they wanted to keep going.
They wanted more, and they just wanted to go on and attack particularly the British settlements in the north and Transjordan and so on.
They wanted to create an empire extending across all of the Muslim Ummah. They would have, God knows where they would have stopped, maybe in France, given the chance.
So when Ibn Saud tried to restrain them and ask them not to launch attacks into these territories, they rebelled.
They revolted against him, and they accused him of being an infidel, of having abandoned the faith of Islam and becoming worldly and all that kind of thing.
They said, why Ibn Saud sent his kids or children or sons abroad to London this is against Islam? Why we had the new technology coming, wireless station, whatever, this is against Islam?
If Abdulaziz were to stay in power, he had to destroy the Ikhwan. But how could he, the defender of Islam, justify going to war against his Muslim fighters? His way out was to win over the religious establishment, the ulama, who were regarded as the moral guardians of the realm.
He turned to the religious establishment in Riyadh. He said, "You judge this. Judge between me and the Ikhwan." So they looked into the Islamic laws. They scrutinized the Holy Quran and the Hadith, and found that King Abdulaziz was right. So they gave the famous fatwa, which said that the Ikhwan were wrong. They had no right under Islamic law to rebel against the ruler.
So from that moment, they actually changed their role, the ulama, and they became almost like a force to be used to sanction politics. And that was the crucial moment in 1927.
With the ulama's consent, Abdulaziz crushed the Ikhwan. The path was now clear. In 1932, Abdulaziz declared himself a king, and for good measure, gave his name to the country, Saudi Arabia. To unite the kingdom, King Abdulaziz married a daughter of every tribal chief in his realm and produced 45 legitimate sons. Every Saudi king since has been a son of Abdulaziz. How many daughters he produced is unknown. They are not counted. Abdulaziz would not forget that religion and the ulama remained central to his rise to power. He became the kingdom's chief defender of the faith. But Saudi Arabia would have remained an insignificant backwater in world affairs if it were not for the discovery of oil. King Abdulaziz was aware that neighboring states like Iraq and Bahrain had great natural resources, but most experts did not believe that the fields extended to Saudi Arabia. Then, in 1931, they were surprised.
There was an American philanthropist called Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane actually came to Saudi Arabia, and he saw King Abdulaziz. And King Abdulaziz was complaining about the lack of availability of water in the country.
Mr. Crane sponsored a geological survey.
He wasn't looking for oil. So it is by chance that we discovered oil. We were looking for water. And this feat happens until today. Every time we look for water, we find oil.
But the only way to get it out of the ground was to invite foreign companies into the kingdom. And Abdulaziz feared that inviting foreigners, or infidels, would be resisted by the religious establishment. He invited them anyway.
The king asked the companies to come. One of the scholars challenged that. He said the King of Saud is doing something against Islam. So the king knew about this, and he asked the scholars to come to his court. When he came, he said, I want you to give me an example why I shall not do that. He said, this is against Islam. He said, prove to me. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ used Jews, used Christians. He did not say, these are non-Muslim, I cannot be in touch with them, I cannot utilize them. Didn't the Prophet use them? The scholar said, yes. He said, I'm doing that the same.
In 1933, the first foreign oil prospectors started arriving in the kingdom. King Abdulaziz did not care who got the concession, as long as they paid the money up front. The British showed interest, but it was the Americans who paid $170,000 in gold for a concession that would turn out to contain the biggest oil fields on Earth.
The first number of holes was dry, and the question was, why should we continue with this? They had been ordered to stop, and they'd failed to read their mail or whatever, and so they did strike the oil, and that well is today operating.
The Arabian American Oil Company, or Aramco, was created to prospect for oil and market it. America's 4 largest oil corporations became the sole shareholders.
When King Abdulaziz went to open the first oil field, and he smelled the sulfur, and he was repugnantly surprised by the smell, and they told him, but Your Majesty, this is what oil, the sulfur of oil smells like. So, oh, let me smell more of it.
The king still had little idea what riches Saudi oil would soon bring. But by 1945, the U.S. urgently needed oil facilities to help supply its forces fighting around the globe. For President Franklin Roosevelt, oil was an American national security priority. From Yalta, FDR sent a message to the Saudi monarch.
The contacts were made, but the decision was kept secret until after he left. The Minister of Finance, Abdullah Suleiman, came to the king's wives and said, Abdulaziz sends his greetings. I am at sea, on my way to meet Roosevelt. We'll be back in 2 or 3 days.
Any royal trip like this has to be big. And it's not just for a show. No. It's like, unifying all portions of the society with you together. So he had his own advisors. He has some of his own sons, princes. He had some of his tribal chieftains at the time. So it's like a small state moving outside its own state to meet Roosevelt, and it has to be, from all portions of society.
It was a very interesting meeting. Here's Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and as you know, he's not a big man, and he's in a wheelchair, and he's on the deck of the Quincy, and King Abdulaziz, who's about 6'3" and 6'4" big, stricken with trachoma, not seeing too good, but walking with a cane, and these two hit it off right away. King Abdulaziz started kidding Roosevelt about, you're lucky you're in that wheelchair, you can wheel yourself anywhere. And Roosevelt said to him, if you like this wheelchair so good, I have an extra one here, I'll give it to you.
After exchanging gifts, they got down to business. America needed to lease an airport and Navy refueling station for its war against Japan. But it was the security of the Saudi kingdom that was at the forefront of King Abdulaziz's concerns. He requested U.S. military assistance and training, and they agreed to construct the Dhahran military base. In return, the king guaranteed that the U.S. would always have secure access to Saudi oil.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia. You give us oil at cheap prices, and we will give you protection. This protection eventually evolved into an American hegemony over the entire Gulf region, and the deal extended to the Gulf region, that this was an American area of influence, and in return for this, it shall be protected from all enemies.
And then there was the issue of Palestine.
Roosevelt said to him, Your Majesty, you know, I'd like to get your opinion on a problem that I'm facing back home. He said, you know, a lot of my constituents are pressuring me to recognize the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he said, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. And King Abdulaziz said, Mr. President, what Hitler did to the Jews was a terrible thing. It was the worst thing that man could do to man. But he said, I don't understand why you're talking about taking land away from us, the Arabs, and giving it to the Jews. We didn't do anything to the Jews. If you want to do something for the Jews, why don't you give them the best part of Germany?
When he heard the position of King Abdulaziz about this issue, he said, I could promise you one thing. The promise that I could make is that I will not do or make any decision if I don't consult with your side and with the Jewish side. Both sides has to be consulted in order to reach one decision.
Later, FDR sent the king a letter confirming their understanding. In it, he further stated, I will take no action which might prove hostile to the Arab people. Roosevelt died a week after sending the letter. By the time World War II ended, Harry Truman was President of the United States.
The unconditional surrender of Japan.
2 years later, the UN met to vote on the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Prince Faisal, the king's second son, arrived in New York, confident the U.S. would vote against partition. He had been told that by General George Marshall, former commander of the American Army and one of President Truman's top aides.
Faisal felt that Marshall had given him an assurance at the United Nations that we would not vote for it, that we would take some other action, and that Marshall had promised him that, and that we had failed to do so.
The United Kingdom, abstain. Saudi Arabia, no. The United States, yes.
When Truman decided otherwise and the U.S. supported the partition of Palestine, Faisal took it as a personal affront.
لقد شعرنا كما يشعر غيرنا بما قامت به بعض الدول الكبرى من الضغط على أعضاء هذه المنظمة للتصويت في جانب التقسيم.
Saudi Arabia joined a failed effort to destroy the nascent Jewish state. It has since never officially recognized Israel and is technically still at war with it. But the king still knew he needed American protection.
The king made his views very clear, including his sense of disappointment. But his main concern at that time was encirclement. He felt that with the Hashemites in Iraq and in Jordan, that he was encircled. So the sense that there were hostile elements around the country, coveting its riches and counting upon its internal weakness, its limited ability to defend itself, hence it needed an outside protector.
Just before his death in 1953, the ailing founder of the kingdom started delegating his power to his sons. His eldest, Prince Saud, who had accompanied him in battles, was designated the next king. His second, Prince Faisal, was to mind foreign affairs.
He prepared for his succession with the help of Prince Saud and Prince Faisal, the eldest. He told them, your unity will continue my reign and preserve the family and the unity and prosperity of the country. Avoid differences. Beware if you separate.
When King Abdulaziz died, people were afraid. He was the force, he was the symbol. He was almost the bureaucracy himself. Everything had to come through his desk because it was a nation it's a startup, like a corporation today. You find the entrepreneur who starts a corporation, they've got their hands on things.
King Abdulaziz was a power, and he was strong, and he brought strength to the room, and you could see what he did, bringing the country together. Saud, on the other hand, people that dealt with him never considered him bright.
I don't recall anything substantive that Saud ever said on whatever the issues might be. Very pleasant, very nice, but inconsequential.
He loved the desert in the sense that he had these huge tents with every amenity possible. I mean, air conditioning and all the latest food from Paris and States and everything else. He loved the trappings of being king. The palaces and the adulation of the crowds, the foreign dignitaries would come and talk to him, and all of his retainers, of course, acting with due respect. And so, I mean, he loved being king. The only thing is he wasn't king in any substantive way.
He was soft. And if you're going to be a ruler in Arabia, you've got to be tough. You've got to be like a hawk. You've got to be like a falcon. That's what gets respect. And at the end of the day, Saud's generosity went so far, but he wasn't tough enough.
The king also enjoyed American hospitality. He became a regular visitor to Saudi Arabia's oil-rich eastern province, where the Americans lived very differently than the Saudis.
When the Americans came to the eastern province with the Aramco company, they had to live in a compound area. Inside, they have their own conditioned situation like in the United States. Outside, they have to live with the Saudis as the tradition exists.
They started building these camps. It was new to us. Air conditioning was new to us. All these things. And then, what was good about Aramco is they shared it. They used to get canned food. We've never seen canned food at the time. And we used to fight over who takes the empty cans, because these are toys for us as kids. So we were always glad to see the Americans come in, and especially the chewing gum. I mean, the chewing gum was a big contributing factor of liking. I remember the first time when we had a refrigerator that was supplied by Aramco to a number of people. My father was one of them. We as kids were sitting there, must be 16 hours, to see how ice is going to be formulated within this refrigerator. Of course, it took 16 hours because every time we opened the refrigerator, it loses its freezing impact. So we were absolutely, it was magic when we saw a cube of ice. We didn't really know the world of technology. We just thought it was different, and it is America.
The Saudis were interested in one thing, and that is that their oil industry was preserved and being handled in a way where they could negotiate and they could increase the oil prices and so on. And they had extremely good relations with Aramco.
They were making a lot of money, but they were spending it foolishly. The country was broke. They had to borrow money. They borrowed money from Aramco.
King Saud was much criticized for his handling of finances, but little was known about his other weakness, a safely guarded secret, which contributed to his downfall.
We had a vice president for Aramco whose name was Floyd Oliger, and he was with the king one time, and the king was tired, he was sick, and so Oliger said to him, "Your Majesty, why don't you go out into the desert, do a little hunting and relax, and we have a wonderful guest house So they thought that was a good idea. When the king landed, one of the things they were unloading from the plane was liquor and hard whiskey. Well, we took a look at this, and where did they put the stuff? They put the stuff under the king's bed in the guest house. So of course, we were kind of shocked. And during the stay, we could see that they would drink this stuff straight. But it was kept very quiet.
King Saud's drinking was kept quiet in part because the king was an important asset for the Americans. Since Gamal Abdel Nasser's overthrow of the King of Egypt in 1952, the balance of power in the region had changed. Nasser aligned himself with the Soviet Union and proclaimed himself a socialist and pan-Arabist. For both Saudi Arabia and America, this was a threat.
The Cold War was at its peak, where you had two mighty empires battling out across the whole planet, destroying nations in their path. And you had the end of colonialism and these newly liberated countries coming out full of vitality, full of energy, and wanting to prove themselves. And the theme was out with the old, in with the new. Who cares whether the old was good or bad? It doesn't matter. We want to change. Khalas, we want to change and get everything new. So in this kind of environment, we are who are quintessentially old. You know what I mean? We were the odd ones out. We were going against the trend.
We did not want to be part of that new thinking in terms of socialism, communism. We've already had our ism. We've already had Islam. We were happy, and we united around Islam. And anything that would have come to Saudi Arabia would have unraveled the country.
Nasser wanted Saudi oil under his control, saying it belonged to all Arab peoples. The Americans moved to shore up support for King Saud.
Saudi Arabia is absolutely a linchpin, a key to our relationship in the whole area. So oil is at the very center of that, and Russian power coming down there and having control of those oil fields would have been a major, major blow to us.
The Eisenhower administration had the idea that perhaps King Saud could be built up in a political fashion that might make him a contender with Nasser in terms of leadership in the Arab world.
The White House said, we are inviting His Majesty and 8 of his retinue. And we took that to the king, and particularly to his advisors. They looked at us and we looked at them, and there was to be no way there would only be 8. Well, one thing led to another, and by the time they got on the ship, there were about 80.
After arriving in New York, King Saud and his entourage flew to Washington. Saud became the first Saudi monarch invited to America on a state visit.
Eisenhower met him at the airport, which was very, very unusual, and he just determined that he was going to treat Saud as his great good friend.
Eisenhower wanted a renewal of the lease on the Dhahran Air Base, a useful strategic asset in the Cold War. King Saud wanted the money that the U.S. would pay to extend the lease.
My father at the time, was negotiating the agreement. He was very sensitive to not calling it a base. It was a transit place for the Americans to take fueling, period.
The exact details of the Dhahran Agreement are revealed in this original copy of the accord. This agreement constitutes, until today, the basis of U.S.-Saudi military cooperation.
In exchange for our free use of the Dhahran airfield, They wanted all kinds of materials. They wanted tanks, for one thing, and they wanted training, and they wanted planes, and they wanted anything we would give them.
The agreement was celebrated with great pomp. King Saud was given full honors.
The official visit was glittering and fine, but when it was all over, one sort of felt, you know, what is this all about? Because he's clearly not the man for this.
Eisenhower's plan to build up Saud as the alternative Arab leader seemed doomed to fail. King Saud spent much of the money from the Dahran lease on luxury trips to Europe. A rift was fast developing in the family.
His extravagance wasn't the big issue. Kings can be extravagant and still remain king. The big issue was the running of the government. That was the biggest problem. It was all personal.
We were really worried about Saudi Arabia. I mean, I'm not talking just about Aramco. I'm talking about the people in the U.S. government and everybody were worried about Saudi Arabia, and we realized that if anybody was going to save Saudi Arabia, it was going to be Faisal. And a lot of people worried, as we did, living in Riyadh, that there'd be a kind of a civil war.
The Al Saud brothers realized that something had to be done.
The step of removing a monarch is something that is not likely taken by anyone. It is a very serious, very dangerous step. Removing one monarch, well, you can always remove another.
So the brothers all got together, all of them. It was their own best interest. They had to make a move. And they decided in November of '64 to go to the religious leaders, and they decided this is the way they could do it.
And they got a fatwa from the religious leaders sanctioning the abdication and sanctioning Faisal's taking over the throne.
Once more, the Saudi monarchy was saved from the brink of disaster by the ulama.
The family decision to depose Saud in the 1960s was really more of a turning point than the death of Abdulaziz in 1953, because it was finally coming into the modern world, but also proving that the desert democracy of sitting around the campfire and the family picking the toughest man for the job could work in the 20th century, and the speed with which the change was actually accomplished and the new direction that the country took. That, I think, was the decisive turning point in the history of Saudi Arabia in the middle of the 20th century.
King Saud and his entourage were quietly asked to leave the country. The ailing Saudi monarch spent his last years exiled in Athens, Greece.
It was my first year at Georgetown, 1964. I was called in by the dean of the university, who, when I went in the office, I thought I had done something wrong or something. And he said, well, now, Turkey, your situation has changed, and are you thinking that perhaps we could provide you with some bodyguards? In those days, there was no internet, there was no instant news service. I had absolutely no idea that on that day, Monday, that my father had become king.
King Faisal had a lot to do. But almost every aspect of bringing the kingdom up to date was bound to bring him into conflict with the ulama. In their view, every innovation threatened Islam.
Essentially, modernity means westernization. This is the fact. It's like a buzzword, okay? Modern means westernized. This is where we have problems, because people want to run their lives better, but not necessarily sacrificing their own culture and their own history in order to become copies of Frenchmen or copies of the English or false Americans. They don't want that.
He decided that there should be girls' schools in Saudi Arabia, and there was an uproar about it. All the old fathers came along and said this was awful. Who knew what would happen when the girls got education? And Faisal said, in that case, don't send your daughters to the schools. And if you don't want, if a majority of people in your village or town don't want a girls' school, you won't have one. But those who do want to have a school must have one.
I would have been illiterate if they didn't have schools at the time. And in fact, I was lucky to go to one of the early private schools that were established in the 60s. Female education was put under the directory of a separate body that would control the curriculum and make sure that what the girls are taught in schools is actually suitable for them as girls and as women. So in that way, he managed to reconcile the need for female education and also the requirements of the ulama.
Gradually, indeed, the number of girls' schools was increased, and girls were admitted to universities and so on. All this was done by keeping just a little way ahead of public opinion and always being willing to stop and wait for public opinion to catch up.
But reaching compromise with the ulama was a constant battle. Leading Wahhabi clerics were ever vigilant.
One day, I get a telephone call from our people in Dhahran and says, Mike, they're banning vanilla. The vanilla extract is being banned. I said, why? He said, well, it's got a little alcohol in it. And you know, they're going crazy now. Anything with anything, any alcohol in it, anything. And they're saying to me, look, we can't make ice cream, we can't make bread, we can't make cakes, we can't go on. It's a big problem. We've got to do something about it. So, I happened to be in one of my visits to the king, and I'm telling him about this, and he was amazing. He was amazing, really. He picks up the phone, and the vanilla was allowed in.
But to keep the peace with conservatives, King Faisal made Saudi Arabia a sanctuary for extremist Muslims from abroad. When governments in Egypt and Syria cracked down on fundamentalist religious scholars, King Faisal invited them to teach Saudi Arabian youth. Faisal's decision had far-reaching consequences.
There was an influx of them here, and where did they work? They worked in the education and in other professional works, and that's when the problem started here.
Many of today's Saudi radicals studied under Egyptian and Syrian fundamentalists.
They misused their hospitality. We dealt with them honestly, and they dealt with that with us underhandedly. And that's a mistake that's not going to be repeated.
Religious conservatives staged one of their biggest protests in 1965, when Faisal approved TV broadcasts in the kingdom.
They considered that broadcasting television is a sin and against, because they consider them to be images. And we're not supposed to show images. And they considered that this was rank heresy, and that the government had become in league with the devil.
So what he did is he had somebody recite the Quran and broadcast that and told people, you see this? It's like a sword. You can use a sword for good, or you can use the sword to assassinate. So it's a tool, really. It's like the internet today. The same debate goes on.
A nephew of the king sided with religious conservatives. It would eventually have drastic personal consequences.
One of Faisal's brother's sons staged a demonstration, Prince Khalid ibn Saud, in 1965. And this demonstration was objecting to the introduction of television on the basis that it was un-Islamic.
A group of people got together, not numbering more than 100. They headed towards the television tower in Riyadh and tried to break in, to bring down the television tower.
They fired at the guards fired back, and the prince was killed.
The father then went to Faisal and said, you've got to punish the soldier who killed my son. And Faisal said, no, I'm sorry your son was killed, but he was breaking the law. He fired on the police, they fired back at him, and the policeman is guiltless. I am responsible.
In the spring of 1967, war was brewing. Nasser was moving troops to Israel's border and ordered the UN out. Uniting against Israel, Faisal reconciled with Nasser.
Could I ask His Majesty what sequence of events he would like to see now in the Middle East?
The first thing is the extermination of Israel.
Fearing an attack was imminent, Israel launched a massive preemptive war. In just 6 days, the bulk of Arab armies were destroyed.
It was a devastating effect that the defeat in '67 had on all of us. For King Faisal to see that the rest of Palestine, including the jewel of Jerusalem, had been taken over by the Israelis, he felt a personal loss and a personal affront.
After 1967 and the fall of Jerusalem to the Israelis, that was a turning point in his life. He never smiled again.
Arab leaders were humiliated.